Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for part one of our B-Notice webinar series. I'm Lauren Skinner-Johnson with Convey Compliance, and I will be your moderator today. Before we start the program, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, to facilitate efficiency and respect your time, all of the participants are going to be on mute for the duration of the event. So if at any time during the presentation that you'd like to submit a question, please type it in the questions box in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will review all the questions and respond to as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Also, Convey hosts an annual tax and regulatory conference, the C2 Summit, that will be held at the Omni Shore Motel in Washington, D.C., Wednesday, September 28th through Friday, September 30th. And for attending today's webinar, we'd like to offer you a discount of $100 off of your registration. Convey's C2 Summit is a live tax information reporting seminar that includes about 2.5 days of regulatory, compliance, and Convey solution sessions, including sessions on B-notices and penalty abatement. If you'd like some additional information or if you're interested in registering, please visit c2summit.convey.com. Now I'd like to introduce Neil Lefevre, Product Manager for Convey Compliance. Neil is going to walk us through a high-level overview of the B-Notice process and the penalty notice process and what's new to those processes in 2011. And before I do hand it over to Neil, we'd like to get a better understanding of how B-notices and penalty notices affect your organization with a couple of polling questions. The first question is, how large of an issue are B-notices and penalty notices to your organization? A, not an issue, B, somewhat of an issue, C, a very large issue, or D, I don't know. We'll give you just a couple minutes to answer that question. All right, thank you for those responses. And I have one additional question before I hand it over to Neil. We'd like to know how you manage your B-notice and penalty notice process currently. And your options are A, on paper, B, spreadsheets, C, internal application, D, third-party tool, or E, Convey. All right, thank you very much for your participation in the polls, and now I'd like to hand it over to Neil.
Great, thanks Lauren. So as Lauren mentioned, today we'll be covering kind of a 50,000-foot view of the B-notice process as well as the penalty notice process. And through the penalty notice process, before we begin that, we'll talk a little bit about what's new for 2011 as there are some new changes this year. And then at the end, we'll have some additional resources and also let you know about our second webinar in the series, part 2. So just to kind of kick off the presentation, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about what Convey refers to as kind of the reactive process of TIN management or data cleanup. You can see the arrow is to the right, and in here we're really dealing with responding to B notices, responding to penalty notices, really a reactive process. In part 2, we'll spend more time talking about how you can kind of move that needle to the left and be more proactive in your data cleanup and B notice management process. So we'll talk about things like TIN matching and some other additional items to eliminate B notices and hopefully alleviate some of the pains that many of you are feeling in this process. And through the polling questions that we asked, I've noticed that for a lot of folks on the call, this is at least somewhat of an issue within your organization, and very large issue was the second highest response. And it sounds like a lot of the folks on the call are dealing with this in some sort of manual process, either by spreadsheets, which was the #1 answer, or on paper itself. So again, we'll be covering a lot more in the second session on how to use other tools and techniques to help alleviate some of that pain. So just to kick this off, kind of the overall timeline that you deal with in regards to B&P notices. So in January, let's say January of this year, you print and mail your 1099 forms. Then March or April comes along, and you're going to transmit all those records to the IRS. What the IRS is going to do is they're going to take that data. They are going to look for two things. One is any records that you submit that have missing TINs, or any records that don't match what they have on file. So the TIN and or name that you submitted doesn't match what is on file with them. And for anything that is missing or a mismatch, they're going to generate what's called a CP2100 or CP2100A, aka B notices, and they're going to send you those notices, either via CD, DVD, or on paper. You're going to get those responses, or those notices. You are going to send solicitations to your recipients or vendors, depending on what industry you're in, and we're going to spend a lot of time kind of talking through that process. That's going to all happen in October. So it's kind of receiving the data from the IRS, generating outbound solicitations. Then you move into November. You're going to collect those responses from the solicitations. You're going to update your records, and you're going to start and stop backup withholding. And again, we're going to dive deeper into that kind of time frame as well. And then August of the next year, you're going to receive a penalty notice for this year. So in 2011, you're going to receive B notices for records that you submitted in 2010, and then in August of 2012, so we're kind of talking about a couple-year span here, you're going to receive penalties for any missing or incorrect information that you submitted. And then again, you're going to go through a solicitation process and respond to that penalty notice and hopefully abate some of those penalties or get the IRS to alleviate your organization from paying those penalties. So let's dive in and let's start with B notices. So what is a B notice? B notice, what it stands for is backup withholding notice, and this is due to the data that you submitted to the IRS either being missing, the TIN is missing, or the name TIN combination is incorrect. And the forms that appear on a B notice are, there's 6 of them, the 1099B, the DIV, the INT, the miscellaneous, the OID, and the W2G. And these are, and a lot of organizations refer to as the backup withholding forms. As I mentioned, the IRS will alert you of missing or incorrect information on CD or DVD via the CP2100 or the CP2100A if you're a smaller volume filer or have less B notices. And then again, these notices are based on your prior year transmittal. So the B notices for this year will actually be for data submitted for 2010 forms. So you receive these B notices from the IRS, and you should be asking yourself, well, now what do I have to do? So for each B notice that you receive, what you need to do is you need to search your accounts for that TIN and name combination. So if they give you a B notice for TIN 123 John Doe, you need to check and see if you have that record on your side. If you do, you have 15 business days to send a B notice solicitation. And I'll talk more about those solicitations in a minute. Once you send those solicitations, your recipient or vendor has 15 days to respond to that. So we're talking about a 30-day overall window to get the information from the IRS, figure out what type of solicitation you need to send it out, and get the response back. after that 30-day window closes, you need to begin backup withholding. And backup withholding currently is 28%. So that means for any payments outside of that 30 business day window that you make to an individual, you need to withhold 28%. And then for any records where you're actually missing a 10, it's not a mismatch, those you should begin backup withholding immediately for those records. Now, if you get that B notice for John Doe, TIN 123, and you don't have that record on your side anymore, let's say you talked to John Doe and he gave you a new TIN. At that point, you've already corrected the information and you've already satisfied your B notice at that point. So if you don't have any records that match that TIN or name combination, there's no solicitation required and you do not need to send them a form. So when you actually find a match and you have to send out a solicitation, there's two different types of solicitations that you might have to send. And so a very common question is, how do I know which solicitation needs to go out the door? Does the IRS tell me that? And the answer to that is no. The IRS does not tell you if you need to send them a first B notice or a second B notice. So the IRS uses what's called a 2- and 3-year rule. So you send an individual a first B notice if this is the first time you've ever gotten a B notice for that individual. So that's pretty easy. If you've only gotten it once, you send a first B notice. But you can also send them a first B notice if the last time you got a B notice was more than 3 years ago. So if it's the second B notice within 3 calendar years, outside of 3 calendar years, then there's still a B notice. And then conversely, a second B notice occurs if you receive a B notice for an individual twice within 3 calendar years. So that's what the IRS refers to as a 2- and 3-year rule. And again, this is up to you as an organization to track. So when you get your B notices, you need to check back the prior 2 years to see if you received a B notice for that individual to determine if you should send them a second B notice or a first B notice. So what to actually send to individuals? If it's a first B notice, so you checked back in your prior history and this is the first B notice or the first B notice within 3 years, and you've determined it's a first B notice, you need to send them 2 to 3 documents. So the first one is going to be a cover letter, and here you're going to explain to them what the issue is and that they need to send you a correct TIN and name combination, and that needs to be certified with a signature and date via a W-9. So that second document beyond the cover letter explaining why you're mailing them is a IRS Form W-9 or substitute W-9, and this is what the individual actually needs to fill out, date and sign, and send back to you. And then you can optionally send a reply envelope within that packet as well. So kind of a little tip is that it does cost more to include the reply envelope, but you definitely will see a higher response rate if you include that self-paid return envelope to the individual. So Convey would definitely recommend that you do take the extra time to include that envelope to increase your response rate. And then kind of one side note is that a TIN or name that you're correcting from a W-9 does not require a corrected file to the IRS. So you do not need to go back and correct their 1099 based off a W-9 response. Now, if you do correct a dollar amount as well as a TIN and name, that would then require a correction file to go to the IRS. But just getting a W-9 back does not necessarily trigger a correction file to the IRS. So that's first B notice. Now, second B notice. This is the second time you've received a B notice for the individual within 3 years. You need to send a cover letter. This cover letter is going to look different, and I'll tell you where you can get some sample cover letters at the end of the presentation. But this cover letter is going to look a little bit different. For a second B notice, a W-9 does not satisfy the requirement from the IRS. So in a second B notice scenario, you're not going to send them a W-9 form. What you're going to do is you're going to alert them that they need to, if they're an individual, contact the Social Security Administration and get an SSA printout that they need to return, or if they're a corporation, they need to get a form called 147C, which they need to submit. And for a second B notice to take an individual off of backup withholding, a W-9 does not suffice. So you do need either an SSA printout or a 147C. So you've gotten your information from the IRS. You have determined what's a first B notice, what's a second B notice. You've sent out the appropriate forms, either a first B notice packet or a second B notice packet, and now you're going to start getting that information back. So what do you do when you start getting the information back? Well, for a first B notice, when you get a W-9, you want to find out if you've received that W-9 within that 30 business days. If you have, what you want to do is you want to update the records on your side with the certified name and TIN, and no further action is required. You don't need to start backup withholding. If you did not receive a W-9 within 30 business days, at that point you need to begin backup withholding on any future payments to that individual at the rate of 28%. And then you're going to want to remit that payment to the IRS and then conversely report that withholding payment on your 945 at year end. So second B notice is a similar process. After the 30 business days, you're going to want to look at your records and understand if you received an SSN printout from the individual or a 147C from any organizations or corporations. If you have, you want to update your records with the correct information and no further action is required. And if not, at that point, you're going to want to begin backup withholding. So with that, we're going to shift gears a little bit and quickly talk through the penalty notice process, or what a lot of folks call the 972 CG, which is what you receive from the IRS for any penalties that you receive. So I want to start off talking through that. There are some changes for 2011 that you do need to be aware of. There are 4 new form types that are going to be included on the penalty notice 972 CG this year. Form 1042S, although this is not a new form, this is the first time the IRS will ever include it on a penalty notice to organizations. So for many folks out there, they've been doing 1042S for many years. They've never had any penalties applied based on the filings that they've had, and that is about to change. So this year you will start seeing that form type included in your penalty assessment. There are 2 new form types that the IRS added last year, the 3921 and 3922 for stock purchase plans, and those will also be included on the 972 CG. And there is a new form type coming out this year, 1099K, and that will also be included on future 972 CG notices as well. The last change for 2011 is that the penalties for late and incorrect filings are doubling this year, and I'll touch on that more in a slide or two. And then I just wanted to recap some changes from last year. Last year, the IRS deprecated a form called the SSA 7028, which is what an individual used to have to give you on a second B notice. And the IRS has since changed that. That form is no longer used, and they now just require an SSA printout. And you heard me mention that before, so make sure that you are receiving the SSA printout instead of Form 7028. So what exactly is a penalty notice from the IRS? So as I mentioned, this comes essentially 2 years after you filed your 1099s, and it comes about a year after the B notices that you've received. Or I'm sorry, it comes 2 months after the B notices that you received for tax year 2 years prior. And so what are you actually being penalized on? You're going to be penalized on records that you filed that have a missing or incorrect TIN. You're going to get penalized for any late returns you had. So let's say there's a set of records that you forgot to file. There's going to be a penalty assessed with those, and also corrections have a penalty associated with them. And then lastly, this doesn't happen very often anymore, but if you send your transmittal in an incorrect format and don't get it situated with the IRS, or let's say you send your 1099s on paper instead of electronically like the IRS requests, they would potentially assess a penalty for that. So I mentioned in the last slide that the penalties are increasing. There's a breakdown of them on the slide for you. So if you file a correction within 30 days of the due date, so in general that's going to be at the end of June, you'll be assessed a $30 penalty per return with a maximum of $250,000, and that's double from $15 last year. Before August 1st, it's $60. After August 1st, it's $100, which again, both of those are double. And then the IRS has something called intentional disregard. So let's say you just decide you don't want to file your 1099s this year. If the IRS believes that you intentionally disregarded filing your 1099s, they will fine you up to will fine you $250 per form, and there is no cap on that penalty. So when you get the 972 CG from the IRS, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you respond to it within 45 days. If for some reason you can't respond to the IRS penalty within 45 days, you can request an extension, but you have to make that request within the 45-day window for them to honor it. If you do not respond within 45 days or request an extension, you will be assessed the full penalty. So kind of the whole point of this is the IRS assesses this penalty, and what your job is to do is to establish what they call reasonable cause. And if you establish reasonable cause for why there were errors in your 1099s, they will reduce or completely remove the penalty. So a couple things that you want to do to establish reasonable cause with the IRS is you want to prove that you performed your required actions for B notices. So you sent out your first and second B notices, you collected the responses, the W-9s. You also want to make sure that you can prove that you performed your annual solicitation for any missing TINs, and you also performed annual solicitations for incorrect TINs or names. And you know, in general, you can usually get part of the penalty abated or waived, but what we're hearing in the industry is that the IRS is becoming a lot less lenient on abating these penalties, and they are assessing you know, the full penalty in many cases, or a much higher percentage of the penalty that they have in years past. So you definitely want to make sure that you're taking the proper steps, doing the solicitations, making sure you have a solid case to abate those penalties. And we'll talk about building that case and how you can do that in part 2 of our webinar series. And then kind of the holy grail, if you will, the IRS has what they call a penalty de minimis. If you only have 0.5% of your total returns incorrect, the IRS will not assess a penalty notice on you. So that's kind of the goal that you want to be striving for in getting correct TIN and name information. And when you file that transmittal, if you can get to 0.5%, you don't have to deal with penalty notices at all. So for any records that appear on the 972 CG penalty notice, there's a solicitation process that's very similar to B notices. So one thing to note is that if you did receive a B notice for an individual who is on the penalty notice, you do not need to send an additional solicitation. You've satisfied that penalty notice by sending the B notice earlier in the year. So that's a great way to reduce the amount of forms that you need to send out. And then just one quick note on the 1099-R form. That's a very popular form type, so I just wanted to mention there are some special rules surrounding 1099-R. You have 30 days in the case of a 1099-R to send a solicitation. The recipient has 45 days instead of 30 days to respond to that solicitation. And if you would like to allow your recipients to change their withholding elections, you can include a W-4P with the packet that you send to them. So with that, that's kind of the high-level areas that I wanted to cover as it related to B notices or backup withholding notices and penalty notices. As I mentioned, we have a second part to this webinar, and there's going to be a few things that we're going to cover. If you remember the slide I showed earlier in the presentation, it's moving that needle from a reactive state to a proactive state. So we're going to go over some ways in which you can proactively ensure that your data is accurate and avoid the whole penalty and B-notice process altogether. Give you some ways to reduce the print and mail costs associated with P and B notices. Talk about what you should be tracking to build a strong case for abating any penalties that you should be assessed. And we'll also cover some tips and tricks as it relates to using automation to streamline this process. And I would highly recommend anyone who answered that they were using spreadsheets or paper in the polling question to definitely make sure that they attend the second session, as there's some great tools out there to help track this for you and make this process a lot easier for you. So that is next Thursday, August 11th from 2 to 2:30.
All right, great. Thanks, Neil. We've got a lot of great questions coming in, and we have very high attendance today, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. The first question that we've seen a couple of times, can you explain what the Form 1099-K is?
Sure, that's a great question. So there's a lot of confusion around this form because it is a new 1099 form to the series. And who this really applies to are what is called merchant acquirers. So it's organizations out there that settle payment transactions for credit cards. So if you're in the insurance industry or the casino industry or manufacturing, in a lot of cases that form's not going to apply to you. There are some nuances to it, so we definitely recommend that you seek some inside or outside counsel on 1099-K, but in general it's for organizations who settle credit card transactions or settle what's called third-party payment transactions. So organizations like PayPal and eBay would have a 1099-K responsibility. So there was a question about if the SSA printout had a form number on it, and the answer to that is no. If you look in the IRS documentation, they just simply refer to it as an SSA printout. Okay, so another great question. If a W-9 comes back with the same TIN and name combination that the IRS indicated was wrong, should you begin back withholding? And the answer to that is no. In general, as long as they return a certified W-9 to you, you have satisfied the B notice and you do not need to begin back withholding. So another question, what does an individual need for a second B notice? So you're going to want to send them, again, you're going to want to send them a cover letter or notice indicating, what they need to do. If they're an individual, they need that SSA printout. And if they're an organization, they need that Form 147C. And I mentioned that there was a place where you could find some samples of those cover letters. And the IRS puts out a publication called the 1281, IRS publication 1281. You can either Google it, or if you go to irs.gov and you just type in 1281, it's going to give you that document. And in that document, it has not only the W-8 and W-9 series forms embedded in it, but it also has some information on what needs to be included on the cover letters for both first and second B notices. So if you haven't sent out a first or second B notice, or you want to look at what the IRS has out there, definitely check out IRS publication 1281.
Great. Thanks, Neil. That's about all the time we have today for questions. We do have a record of everyone's questions, so we will be following up with you. to make sure that you get your questions answered. And I know we've had a lot of questions about whether or not the slides will be available. We have, in fact, recorded this webinar, and the slides will be made available to you in the next couple of days. With that concludes today's webinar. This last slide is a couple of additional resources that you can use. Again, we invite you to register for the C2 Summit at c2summit.convey.com. Of course, our website is convey.com, and you can also check out our 1099 News blog at 1099news.com. Thank you again for joining us, and that concludes our webinar. Have a great afternoon.